didn't fire me on a Tuesday by accident. My mother-in-law had circled that date on her calendar 3 weeks in advance. I know because I found the printout in the recycling bin at the lake house. Her handwriting in red marker, neat as a threat. Tuesday the 14th. Done by noon. She almost made it. I was sitting at my desk at 11:47 when my husband walked in, not to check on me, not to say good morning. He walked in with HR behind him and a folder under his arm, and the look on his face was the one he uses when he's already decided something and just needs the room to catch up. "We need to talk about your role here," he said. My role. In the company I had licensed the core patent for. In the building my name was on the deed of. In the firm that ran on software I had written the original architecture for, sitting at a kitchen table in 2009, while he was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his MBA. I looked at the folder, I looked at him, then I looked past both of them, out the window at the Atlanta skyline, and I thought about how strange it is that the people who underestimate you the most are always the ones who've been watching you work the longest. "Sure," I said, "let's talk. My name is Leigh. I'm 41 years old. I spent 11 years building a structural engineering firm from a 2-person LLC into a company with 63 employees, 7 active municipal contracts, and a headquarters I own outright on Peachtree Street. I did this mostly while being described at various dinner parties hosted by my mother-in-law as Adrian's wife, the one who works in construction. Adrian was my husband. He came into the firm 6 years ago as COO. He was good at it. I want to be honest about that because this story is not about a useless man. It's about a useful man who let his mother convince him that useful was the same as essential. That because he ran the operations, he was the operations. That the thing he'd been handed was the thing he'd built. His mother's name is Margaret. She is 72 years old, sharp as wire, and has spent the better part of a decade treating my professional accomplishments as a kind of accident. Like I'd tripped and fallen into a successful business and didn't have the sense to know it. She smiled at me the way you smile at someone who's holding something fragile, waiting for them to drop it. What I didn't understand until much later was that she wasn't just waiting. She was planning. It started at Thanksgiving. Not this past one. The one before. We were at the lake house, Margaret's place up in Blue Ridge, the one she'd inherited from her own mother and held over everyone's heads like a chandelier that could fall at any moment. She'd invited someone I didn't know. She introduced her as Donna, a dear friend from the club. But Donna had the specific posture of someone who has been briefed. She asked Adrian questions that were slightly too knowledgeable, about cash flow cycles, about the timeline on a particular city contract, about whether the firm was considering any restructuring. Adrian answered easily, the way you answer questions from someone safe. I watched from across the table and said nothing. I refilled my water glass. I asked Margaret if she needed anything from the kitchen. I smiled at the right moments. Later, washing dishes, I heard Adrian say to his mother in the hallway, "Leigh doesn't need to be part of that conversation." "Of course not," Margaret said. "She's got enough on her plate." I set a glass down on the counter very carefully. I thought, okay, what happened over the next 4 months I can only describe as a slow excavation. The kind where someone is digging under your foundation and you can feel the house shifting, but you keep telling yourself it's the weather. Donna, as it turned out, was a consultant. Margaret had hired her to assess whether Adrian could buy out my share of the firm through a series of equity maneuvers that would have required me to either sign documents I hadn't read or face a prolonged legal challenge. The plan, as I eventually pieced it together, was elegant in the way that things designed to hurt you quietly are elegant. Step 1. Establish Adrian as the operational face of the company. This had already happened naturally. He was the one in the meetings, the one who took the mayor's calls, the one at the ribbon cuttings. My name was on the patents and the lease and the original articles of incorporation. But in the public-facing story of the firm, I had become a background figure. A founder, yes, but founders fade. Step 2. Approach the minority shareholders. We had 3, all friends of Adrian's from business school, and quietly secure their support for a restructuring vote that would dilute my ownership stake from 51% to something manageable. Step 3. Present me with an offer. Generous on paper, The kind of offer that looks like respect and is actually a door-marked exit. I found all of this out not through any dramatic confrontation. I found it out because my accountant called me in January to ask why she was receiving duplicate requests for the previous 3 years of financial records, once from me and once from a firm she didn't recognize. I told her I hadn't made any requests. She read me the name of the firm. I wrote it down. Then I called my attorney. His name is Walt. He has been my attorney since I was 29 years old and filed my first LLC paperwork at a folding table in his office in Buckhead. He is not the kind of man who raises his voice. He's the kind of man who asks one question, listens to the whole answer, and then says something that makes you understand exactly how much trouble you're in. How much does Adrian know about the building lease? He asked. He knows I own the building, I said. He's always known. Does he know the terms of the lease the firm pays to you? I paused. The lease is market rate. I've never, Leigh. Walt's voice was very calm. The lease has a clause. If there's a change in operational control of the tenant entity, you have the right to terminate with 30 days notice or renegotiate terms. Do you remember signing that? I did remember. I had thought of it as a standard protective clause at the time, the kind of thing you put in documents because you're being careful, not because you expect to need it. Yes, I said. Then you should also remember, Walt said, that the patents are licensed to the firm under your name, not transferred, which means if the firm's ownership structure changes materially, the license terms revert to negotiation. I sat very still. They don't know that, I said. No, Walt said. They don't. I asked him what he thought I should do. He said, I think you should let them keep digging. The board vote was scheduled for March 15th. I know this because Adrian told me, finally, over dinner on a Wednesday in late February. He had the folder again. I was starting to think of it as his folder, the one that contained his version of things, and he set it on the table next to my plate and said the firm needed to evolve its leadership structure. He said it like he practiced it. The consonants were too clean. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of chicken. I chewed it slowly. What kind of evolution? I asked. He explained the restructuring. He explained the offer. He explained that the minority shareholders were aligned, that this was the direction the firm needed to go, and that my continued involvement was something they all valued, just in a more advisory capacity. Advisory. That word. I thought about 2009. I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about the first contract I ever signed, a small drainage project for a county in North Georgia that paid $47,000, which I used to make payroll for 2 people for 3 months while I looked for the next one. And your mother? I asked. Is she aligned too? He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. This is a business decision, he said. Of course it is, I said. I picked up the folder. I looked at the offer figure. I set it back down. I'll have Walt review it, I said. What I did between February and March 15th, I did quietly. Walt filed a notice with the firm's registered agent clarifying the patent license terms. He also sent a letter to the 3 minority shareholders explaining certain legal realities they may not have been made aware of, specifically, that any restructuring vote that resulted in a change of controlling interest would trigger automatic renegotiation of both the building lease and the technology license, and that under current market rates, the adjusted costs would alter the firm's profitability projections significantly. He attached the projections. He'd had an analyst run them overnight. I also had a conversation with the city's Office of Infrastructure Contracts. Nothing dramatic, just a routine meeting I'd had standing on the books for months. I mentioned, as context, that there might be some changes in the firm's ownership structure and that I wanted to ensure continuity of the technical leadership on our municipal projects since I was the licensed engineer of record on all 7 contracts. The city project manager, a woman named Sandra who I'd worked with for 4 years, looked at me over her coffee cup. "You're the engineer of record," she said. "Yes," I said. "If your role changes, those contracts would need to be reassigned." "That's my understanding," I said. "I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page." She said she appreciated the heads up. March 15th was a Monday. The board meeting was at 10 in the morning at the firm's conference room, which is on the 4th floor of a building I own. I walked in at 9:58 carrying a cup of coffee and my laptop bag. Adrian was already there. The 3 minority shareholders were there. Donna, the consultant, was there. And Margaret was there, which surprised me. She wasn't a shareholder. She had no formal role. But she was seated at the far end of the table, and no one seemed to think this required explanation. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, like I was holding something fragile. Walt was not there in the room. He was on standby. They walked through the restructuring proposal. It took about 20 minutes. The language was careful, the framing was generous, and the subtext was a door-marked exit with a bow on it. When they finished, the room looked at me. I opened my laptop. "Before we vote," I said, "I want to make sure everyone has reviewed the materials Walt sent last week." One of the minority shareholders, a man named Chris, who had known Adrian since Wharton, shifted in his seat. "We reviewed them," he said. "Good. Then you're aware that the restructuring as proposed would trigger a lease renegotiation. I've had the new terms drafted. I can share the document now if it would be helpful." I turned the laptop to face the table. Under current market rates for this location and square footage, the annual lease payment would increase by approximately $340,000. No one said anything. I've also confirmed with the city's infrastructure office that a change in controlling ownership would require reassignment of the engineer of record on our 7 active municipal contracts. That process typically takes 4 to 6 months, during which contract payments are held in review. I've attached the relevant city guidelines to the materials Walt sent. Margaret made a sound, not quite a word. "And of course," I said, "the patent license. Walt's letter covered the terms. I'm happy to answer questions." Adrian was looking at me, not with anger, with something more complicated. The expression of someone realizing that the room they've been standing in is not the room they thought it was. "Leigh," he said. My name in his mouth sounded strange. "This isn't a business decision," I said. "I agree. Let's talk about what it actually is." The meeting did not end with a vote. What came after was not fast. I want to be accurate about that because the stories we tell about moments like this tend to collapse time. The confrontation happens and then the credits roll and the protagonist walks out into sunlight. It wasn't like that. It was 4 more months of attorneys and mediators and one very long afternoon in which Adrian sat across from me in Walt's conference room and tried to explain that his mother had convinced him this was the right path and that he hadn't meant for it to go this far and that he still believed in what we'd built together. I listened to all of it. I listened the way you listen when you've already made your decision and you're giving someone the courtesy of being heard. The divorce was finalized in September. The prenuptial agreement, which Adrian had signed in 2013 and which I had written with Walt before our engagement, because I had already been building the firm for 4 years by then and I was not romantic about money, held. The firm remained mine. The building remained mine. The patents remained mine. Adrian retained his shares of the equity that had vested during the marriage, which amounted to a little under 8% of the firm's value. He left in October to start something new. I genuinely hope he does well with it. I mean that without irony, which surprises me sometimes. Margaret sent me a letter in November. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph suggested I had been calculating and cold. The second paragraph suggested that what I had done to her son was not something a good person does. The third paragraph said she had always known I was difficult. I read it twice. Then I put it in a file folder in the back of a drawer because I am an engineer and I do not throw away documents. I kept the lake house out of it. That was hers, and I never wanted it. I want to be clear about that because someone will assume otherwise. What I wanted, what I have always wanted, was to build things that hold, structures that distribute weight correctly, systems that function under stress. I learned early that the most important load-bearing element in any design is the one you can't see from the outside. The one that does its work quietly below the surface while everything visible above it looks effortless. I am 41 years old. I run a firm with 63 employees and 7 city contracts and a building on Peachtree Street that I own outright. I sit in the corner office on the 4th floor. the one with the window that faces the skyline, and some mornings the light comes in at a particular angle, and I think about a kitchen table in 2009, and a drainage contract worth $47,000 and 2 people I was trying to keep paid. The day after the board meeting, Sandra from the city's infrastructure office sent me an email. It said simply, "Glad we had that coffee. Let me know what you need for the next contract cycle." I wrote back, "I'll send the proposal Friday." Then I went back to work. There's one more thing I want to say, because it matters, and I haven't figured out how to put it anywhere else in this story. The night before the board meeting, I didn't sleep well. That's the part I don't see in the version of this story that plays out in my head as a clean victory. I lay in the guest room. I had moved to the guest room in January, and I looked at the ceiling, and I felt something I can only describe as grief. Not for the marriage exactly. Not even for him. For the version of the future I'd believed in long enough to build a life around. The version where the person who watched you work also understood what the work was, where being known meant being seen accurately, not just seen at all. I lay there for a long time, and then I got up and made coffee and opened my laptop and checked the document Walter prepared one more time, because that is what I do. I check the load-bearing elements, I verify the structure holds, and then I walk into the room. I walked into the room. That was enough. I've thought a lot about why Margaret did it the way she did. Slowly, quietly over months, through consultants and dinner parties and a man she'd raised to trust her instincts over his own. I used to frame it as a question of greed, but I don't think that's quite right anymore. I think it was about authorship. She needed to be the person who had built something, and the easiest way to do that when you haven't built anything yourself is to take credit for the things someone else built, or to erase the person who did. What she didn't account for was that erasure requires the other person's cooperation. I think about the kitchen table in 2009 a lot. Not romantically, I'm not nostalgic about struggle the way some people are. I think about it because it reminds me that every structure I've built since then, I built from scratch, with no safety net and no cosigner on the risk. That's not a complaint. That's load-bearing information. Because when you know exactly how something was made, when you were the one mixing the concrete, you also know exactly where it will hold and where it won't. Margaret never had that knowledge. She only ever had access to the finished building. There's something I've come to understand about people who underestimate you. They're not stupid, and they're not always malicious. Sometimes they simply cannot imagine a version of reality where you were the one doing the foundational work all along. Their mental model of you was built early and never updated. Leigh is Adrian's wife. Leigh works in construction. Leigh has enough on her plate. Every piece of information that didn't fit that model got quietly sorted out. That's not cruelty. It's just a failure of intellectual honesty. The refusal to update what you believe when the evidence says otherwise. That refusal always costs something eventually. It cost Margaret the outcome she'd spent a year engineering. It cost Adrian a firm he'd convinced himself he deserved. It cost them both the version of the story where they were the protagonists. What I want to say, and I mean this without self-congratulation, because the night before that board meeting I was awake at 2 a.m. and I didn't feel powerful. I felt hollowed out. Is that the only reason I was still standing when it mattered was because I had never stopped doing the actual work? I had never let anyone else hold the documents. I had never signed something I didn't read or trusted a relationship to substitute for a contract or assumed that being known by someone meant being protected by them. That's not cynicism. That's just what I learned from building things that have to hold weight, the discipline to keep working when no one is watching you, the honesty to look clearly at what's actually happening instead of what you wish were happening, the integrity to refuse to become the person they needed you to be in order for their plan to work. Passive, grateful, easy to move. Those 3 things, more than any legal clause or patent filing, are what kept the firm mine. Margaret sent me that letter in November and called me calculating. I've kept it. I keep a lot of documents. That one I keep because it's a useful reminder that the people who mistake preparation for coldness are the same people who mistake chaos for warmth. I don't need her to understand. I just needed to know the load-bearing elements were in place. They were. They held. That was always going to be enough.